everyone, I hope you are doing well and preparing well. Today is a very important session which is on Marxist literary theory. When I say it's important, I mean this is the session which will set a tone for the next chapter on culture studies. So sit tight and listen carefully and also try to make notes. So, shall we begin? Let's step back to the roots of Marxist thought. The intellectual foundations lie in the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who gave us the concepts of historical materialism and the famous model of base and superstructure. Their central idea was clear: literature, like all cultural production, cannot be separated from society's material conditions. It always carries the imprint of class relations and modes of production. Pause here and note this: neither Marx nor Engels wrote a full-fledged literary theory, but their scattered reflections laid the groundwork. Engels' letters on realism and Marx's critique of ideology became touchstones for later critics who would treat literature as socially situated practice. Now, here's something important that has been asked in exam. Marxism presents itself not just as a politics, but as a scientific theory of social change. From this perspective, culture mirrors social life, and the artist is described as an engineer of the human soul. That phrase captures how deeply Marxism views art as tied to ideology and class struggle. In its earliest form, Marxist criticism often leaned toward what we call vulgar Marxism, reading literature only as a direct reflection of the economic base. According to the base superstructure model, the economic foundation of society shapes institutions, which in turn produce a cultural and ideological superstructure. Literature, then, is never neutral. It's part of this system. Marx himself summed it up in Capital. The mode of production of material life determines the social, political, and intellectual life process altogether. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but their social being that determines their consciousness. But wait, Marxist criticism didn't stay this narrow. By the 20th century, critics developed more nuanced approaches. They argued that literature couldn't be reduced to a mirror of economics. Instead, one must pay attention to form, style, and meaning while still seeing them as historical products. Terry Eagleton expressed this balance brilliantly when he wrote, "Marxist criticism is not merely a sociology of literature, concerned with how novels get published and whether they mention the working class. Its aim is to explain the literary work more fully, with sensitive attention to its forms, styles, and meanings as the product of a particular history." Asked in exam, can you recall the bigger debates that followed? Marxism claimed universality, but postmodernism rejected all totalizing frameworks. Asked in exam. New historicism borrowed Marxism's attention to ideology and power, yet combined it with reader response theories' focus on subjectivity. Asked in exam. Feminist and post-colonial critics also drew on Marxist insights. Chandra Talpade Mohanty, for example, adapted Marx's dictum: they cannot represent themselves. They must be represented. Asked in exam, to show how women and marginalized groups are often silenced in cultural texts. So, what's the takeaway? Marxist literary theory remains one of the most enduring frameworks. It reminds us that literature is never created in a vacuum. It is both shaped by society and actively shaping ideology. From Marx and Engels to Eagleton, from vulgar Marxism to cultural materialism, it continues to evolve, always keeping class, history, and ideology at its center. Let's step back into the 19th century and meet Karl Marx, one of the most influential thinkers in history. Born in 1818 in Trier, Germany, Marx was the son of a wealthy Jewish lawyer. He studied law and philosophy in Bonn and Berlin, where he was shaped by the ideas of Hegel and Feuerbach. By 1841, he had earned his doctorate from the University of Jena, but instead of a quiet academic career, his path turned toward revolution. Pause here because this is crucial. In Paris, Marx met Friedrich Engels, beginning a partnership that would last a lifetime. Together, they developed a radical critique of capitalism and political economy. Their most famous collaboration was the Communist Manifesto of 1848, asked in exam. this pamphlet declared something unforgettable. All of human history is the history of class struggles. For Marx and Engels, every society was shaped by the conflict between oppressors and oppressed. And they argued history would culminate in the victory of the working class, the proletariat, bringing forth a classless, stateless society. This principle became known as historical materialism, the idea that material and economic conditions form the foundation of social and cultural life. In other words, culture, politics, and ideology are rooted in economics, not floating above them. This idea became the cornerstone of Marxist theory and the starting point for Marxist literary criticism. But the Communist Manifesto was only the beginning. Marx's magnum opus, Das Kapital, with its first volume published in 1867, delivered a detailed critique of capitalism. Here, Marx analyzed surplus value, commodity fetishism, and exploitation, exposing how capital thrives by extracting labor. Earlier works like economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 introduced the concept of alienation, while the German ideology of 1846, co-written with Engels, developed the materialist conception of history. And in the critique of the Gotha program of 1875, Marx famously wrote, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs." This has been asked in exam. Marx's writings don't just belong to economics or politics. They shaped philosophy, history, sociology, and even literary theory. His insistence that culture reflects material conditions paved the way for Marxist literary criticism, cultural materialism, and many of the debates we study today. Picture the 19th century, when Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels introduced a theory that would change the way we think about society, culture, and even literature. This theory is Marxism, and at its heart lies historical materialism. The idea is simple, but powerful social life and institutions are determined by material production. In other words, the way people produce goods, the economic base, shapes everything else: politics, culture, and ideology. Marxism is not just about economics. It has shaped archaeology, anthropology, film theory, political science, psychology, cultural studies, and yes, literary criticism. Marxism insists that societies evolve when their modes of production change, sparking new class struggles and new ways of thinking. Now let's bring this into literature. Marxist literary criticism treats literature as a social institution, bound up with ideology and class. Marx himself argued that human social relationships are determined by the economic base. That means cultural texts, including novels and plays, are not neutral. They reflect, reproduce, and sometimes contest class relations. Terry Eagleton put it brilliantly: Marxist criticism is not merely a sociology of literature. Its aim is to explain the literary work more fully, with sensitive attention to forms, styles, and meanings, but also to grasp those forms as the product of a particular history. This line has been asked in exam, so keep it safe in your notes. In Hungary, Georg Lukács emphasized realism, valuing 19th century novels for their ability to capture social totality, though he dismissed modernist experiments. In Germany, Bertolt Brecht and Walter Benjamin developed Marxist art criticism. Benjamin, in particular, argued that technologies like photography and cinema changed art forever by making it reproducible and democratic. In France, Louis Althusser redefined ideology. Instead of calling it mere false consciousness, he argued that ideology is structural, it shapes human subjectivity itself. In Italy, Antonio Gramsci, writing in his prison notebooks, introduced the concept of hegemony, showing how ruling classes maintain control not just through force but by securing cultural consent. Can you recall which writers were influenced by Marxism itself? Think of Richard Wright, Claude Mackay, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Bertolt Brecht. All of them drew on Marxist insights to connect literature with politics and social struggle. When we think of Marxism, the name Karl Marx comes first. But standing right beside him, shaping the same vision, was Friedrich Engels. Born in 1820, Engels was a German socialist philosopher and the closest collaborator of Marx. Together, they co-authored the Communist Manifesto in 1848, a revolutionary pamphlet that declared all history to be the history of class struggles and called for the eventual victory of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie. They also worked together on the German ideology, where they outlined the principles of historical materialism, connecting economics, politics, and culture to class conflict. Pause here and note this down after Marx's death. Engels didn't step away. Instead, he took responsibility for editing and publishing volumes 2 and 3 of Das Kapital, ensuring that Marx's ideas reached the world. In this way, he safeguarded the intellectual foundation of Marxism and helped establish it as a global critical framework. But Engels wasn't just Marx's shadow. He made powerful contributions on his own. His most important early work was The Condition of the Working Class in England, published in 1845, asked in exam. Based on his observations while living in Manchester, this book exposed the harsh and inhumane conditions faced by industrial workers. Engels described overcrowded housing, diseases, unsafe factories, and the erosion of dignity caused by capitalism. This became one of the first systematic critiques of industrial society, and it laid the groundwork for later Marxist criticism of capitalism. Another key independent text is The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, published in 1884. Here, Engels traced how economic systems shape social institutions. He showed how the rise of private property went hand in hand with the emergence of patriarchy, linking the story of family structures directly to class relations and economic power.